A federal judge tried to humiliate her on the national stage, but what came next left even him speechless. The scene freezes. Jasmine Crockett leans forward, fire in her eyes, her words slicing the air like a blade. Across from her, Judge Gregg Costa, once the towering figure of authority in the room, sits paralyzed. His smirk has vanished, replaced by something rarer, silence. For a split second, the entire chamber holds its breath. Cameras catch the electricity, the stunned hush that feels less like politics and more like history being carved into stone. This wasn't just another courtroom exchange. This wasn't just another politician sparring with a judge. It was something deeper, sharper, more dangerous. It was the sound of arrogance colliding with dignity and dignity winning. But how did we get here? How did a federal judge, armed with the weight of his robe and centuries of institutional power, find himself rattled by a congresswoman who had been underestimated from the very beginning? The truth is, this confrontation was never about legal nuance. It was about identity, respect, and the audacity of one woman refusing to be diminished. Crockett's voice carried more than arguments, it carried generations of struggle, pride, and defiance. And in that frozen moment, as Costa's confidence crumbled, millions watching knew they were witnessing more than politics. They were witnessing a shift. Because this clapback was not contained by four walls. It would travel. It would echo. It would ignite social feeds, inspire hashtags, ripple across communities who had waited too long to see someone stand unflinching against condescension dressed as authority. But before that wave could crash across the nation, we have to rewind back to the arrogance, back to the pressure, back to the moment when Costa believed he had control. And that's where the story begins. To understand why the silence that followed her clapback felt seismic, we have to step back into the heat of that exchange. Judge Gregg Costa wasn't just asking questions, he was performing. With every raised brow, with every clipped interruption, he wasn't seeking clarity. He was asserting dominance. His tone carried that familiar flavor of judicial overreach, the kind that disguises intimidation as inquiry. For Costa, this was a chance to remind the room who held the gavel. For Jasmine Crockett, it was something else entirely, a moment that tested not just her composure, but the dignity of everyone who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or underestimated in halls of power. The stakes were no longer abstract. They weren't about legal procedure or parliamentary order. They were about whether a young black congresswoman could be bullied into silence by the voice of institutional arrogance. And in that courtroom, the imbalance was palpable. Costa had the robe, the bench, the history of centuries on his side. Crockett had only her voice. To some, that might have seemed like a mismatch, but to those who know what it means to be underestimated, her position was all too familiar. Every clipped question he asked, every attempt to box her in, wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others whose truth had been ignored by those who mistook power for wisdom. The tension built like a taut string pulled tighter with each exchange. The judge leaned in, pressing harder, his words laced with a quiet arrogance, the assumption that Crockett would eventually stumble, hesitate, break. But Crockett wasn't stumbling. She was waiting. Calculating. Her eyes steady, her tone measured, her resolve unshaken. And then, just as Costa's questions reached their sharpest edge, just as he pushed one step too far, Crockett unleashed the words that no one saw coming. Words that would flip the power dynamic on its head, leaving the chamber stunned and the judge himself in disbelief. The clash that followed wasn't just another moment in politics. It was the spark that set the entire narrative ablaze. And to see how the fire spread, we need to understand the man who struck the match. Gregg Costa was never supposed to be rattled. His reputation had been built on the opposite, calm authority, sharp wit, and an almost theatrical command of the courtroom. From his early career as a prosecutor to his rise through the federal bench, Costa cultivated an image of the man who always had the last word. Lawyers who argued before him often left with the same impression: sharp questions, cutting remarks, and an unmistakable undercurrent of condescension that said, without words, "I am smarter, I am higher, I am untouchable." He wore impartiality like a robe, but behind that veil, critics noticed something else: a taste for spectacle. Costa had a knack for grandstanding, for turning routine hearings into showcases of his intellect. Some praised him as brilliant, others whispered that he relished belittling those who stood before him. It wasn't enough to win an argument, he had to perform his dominance. That pattern became his calling card. A witness faltered, Costa pounced. An attorney hesitated, he leaned forward with a smirk. To many, he represented the very tension that has long haunted American institutions, the gap between the promise of neutrality and the practice of power. Judges are sworn to weigh fairly, but Costa often weighed with a heavy hand, his tone dripping with superiority. The contradictions were glaring. Here was a man who embodied the ideal of impartial justice, yet time and again, he appeared to take pleasure in pressing too hard, in turning a question into a weapon. Supporters admired his sharpness, detractors saw arrogance masquerading as intellect. And for years, it seemed to work. Costa remained untouchable, his authority rarely challenged, his courtroom style seen as the mark of a formidable jurist. But arrogance carries a hidden flaw: it assumes the stage will always be yours. Costa had perfected the role of the untouchable judge, the man who could reduce attorneys and witnesses alike to silence. What he never anticipated was standing across from someone who wouldn't play by his script. Someone who would not shrink beneath his questions, but instead, rise above them. That someone was Jasmine Crockett. Costa approached their clash with the same confidence he always carried, the belief that his robe, his voice, his presence were enough to control the outcome. He pressed, he prodded, he leaned into the very style that had defined his career. But in this case, the style that had built his reputation was about to backfire. Because what Costa didn't realize, what he couldn't realize, is that Crockett wasn't intimidated. She was prepared. And she was about to deliver a response so precise, so sharp, that the silence it left behind would be remembered longer than any question he had ever asked. But little did he know, the very style he perfected would become his undoing. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin in the halls of Congress or in the heat of a viral confrontation. It began in Texas, where grit isn't just admired, it's required. Before the cameras, before the spotlight, she was a lawyer who built her reputation not by chasing prestige but by defending those who couldn't defend themselves. From criminal defense to civil rights work, Crockett's practice was marked by a simple but radical belief: every person deserves dignity, no matter how the system labels them. Her courtroom was often small, her clients often overlooked. Yet she carried each case with a weight that went beyond the law. It was about fighting for fairness in a system designed to grind down the powerless. That was the soil where her resilience grew: long days, low pay, and the constant reminder that her opponents weren't just other lawyers, but entrenched institutions. Her leap into politics didn't make the climb any easier. As a young black woman, she was often dismissed before she even opened her mouth. Some rolled their eyes at her candidacy. Others whispered that she was too bold, too direct, or simply not the type to win in a state like Texas. But every underestimation became fuel. Crockett turned doubt into drive, proving again and again that the grit she carried into the courtroom translated just as powerfully onto the campaign trail. When she finally won her seat in Congress, it wasn't because she played by the rules of polished insiders. It was because she refused to shrink herself. She spoke in a voice that was sharp, unapologetic, and rooted in truth. For her supporters, she wasn't just another politician, she was a reflection of their own battles, their own resilience against a world eager to underestimate them. But with that voice came constant pressure. The higher she rose, the more she was targeted. Critics tried to box her in, pundits mocked her tone, and colleagues sometimes underestimated her composure, yet every attempt to diminish her only sharpened her resolve. She learned how to stand tall in rooms designed to make her feel small. And that's what brought her into direct collision with Gregg Costa. He believed he was facing another politician who would crumble beneath the weight of his authority. What he didn't see was the long road that had prepared her, the late nights in Texas courtrooms, the campaigns fueled by doubt, the countless moments where she had been told no and had fought until it became yes. Because Crockett's resilience wasn't accidental. It was earned. And it was this very resilience that prepared her for the moment when Costa came swinging. The confrontation began like so many others in Costa's courtroom, with his voice cutting sharp and quick, questions delivered like darts meant to pierce and corner. He leaned forward, his tone clipped, each word heavy with implication. "Answer directly," he pressed, his interruptions slicing through Crockett's responses before her sentences could find their full breath. The rhythm was familiar, Costa in control, his smirk the punctuation mark to every demand. Yet something about this exchange felt different. Crockett didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on his, unshaken, her expression carrying not fear but calculation. Each interruption only seemed to steady her further, as if every attempted put-down was fuel she quietly stored away. The room began to sense it. Reporters scribbled faster, cameras tightened their frames, and even the murmurs in the back rows started to fade. A strange kind of anticipation hung in the air. Costa spoke with the assumption that he was still the only authority that mattered, but Crockett's silence between his questions wasn't the silence of defeat, it was the silence of patience. Then came the shift. Costa leaned harder, his voice rising just enough to reveal agitation. He cut her off mid-sentence, smirking as though the exchange had already been won. For a moment, the chamber seemed to tilt toward him, authority bending the weight of the room in his direction. But Crockett's gaze never moved, her composure never cracked. A hush fell. Even the scrape of a chair in the back seemed too loud, too intrusive. All eyes were locked on her, waiting for a response. The tension pressed down like storm clouds gathering, electricity charging the silence. Costa's smirk lingered, confident, assured, certain that he had drawn her into his familiar trap. And then, with just a few words, she flipped the entire courtroom dynamic. Her voice cut through the tension like a blade, steady and unhurried. "Judge," she began, her tone measured but carrying the weight of every eye in the room, "you can interrupt me as many times as you'd like, but what you can't interrupt is the truth." A ripple moved through the chamber. The smirk that had decorated Costa's face faltered for the first time. Crockett let the silence hang there long enough for everyone to feel it, long enough for the sting to land. Then she continued, her cadence deliberate, every pause a strike. "You sit there in your robe as if that alone makes you the authority on dignity. But dignity isn't handed down from the bench. It's lived. It's fought for. And it doesn't vanish because you raise your voice or cut me off." Gasps rose from the gallery. Pens froze mid-scribble. Even the shuffle of feet quieted as if the air itself refused to break her rhythm. Costa shifted, a flicker of discomfort flashing across his face. The gavel in his hand suddenly felt lighter, almost ornamental, while her words carried the weight of justice itself. Crockett leaned in slightly, her eyes never leaving his. You want me small. You want me hesitant. You want me to forget who I am the moment you lean forward. But I don't forget. I remember every courtroom where I was underestimated, every campaign where they said I didn't belong, every headline that tried to dismiss me. And I'm still here. The chamber exhaled, an almost audible release of energy. Whispered reactions crackled like sparks. Someone in the back let out a quiet "that's right," barely audible, but enough to register. Costa opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, his words betrayed him. The judge who had mastered interruption found himself interrupted not by volume, but by truth. His silence became louder than any question he could have asked. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm dismantling of his authority was more devastating than any outburst could have been. If your goal was to make me shrink, she concluded, then you've already lost. Because I don't shrink. I rise. The gallery erupted not in cheers, but in the kind of stunned murmurs that fill history-making moments. The sound was half disbelief, half awe. Costa sat motionless, robe heavy on his shoulders, expression stripped of its usual certainty. And in that instant, the balance of power flipped. The judge who had entered the exchange certain of victory now sat silent, while the congresswoman he had tried to diminish stood taller than ever. The confrontation was over. But the story was only beginning. Because what Crockett had unleashed in that room wasn't going to stay contained within those four walls. It was about to spread, igniting voices far beyond the chamber. The moment Crockett's words hit the air, they refused to stay confined within the courtroom. Within minutes, the clip was online, first a shaky phone recording, then crisp broadcast footage. By the end of the day, it was everywhere. On Twitter, hashtags lit up, Crockett clapback, dignity over arrogance, speechless judge. Millions watched, shared, and replayed the instant where authority collapsed into silence. Commentators on cable news replayed the exchange in slow motion, marveling at how a single sentence had shifted the balance of power. Activists hailed her as the embodiment of resistance. That's what it looks like when you refuse to be diminished, one civil rights leader tweeted, the post racking up hundreds of thousands of likes. Celebrities joined in, amplifying the clip with their own captions, "This is what strength sounds like." Costa's silence after the exchange became just as viral as Crockett's words. Memes compared his stunned expression to statues, to frozen screens, to outdated relics of authority. The judge who had built his reputation on having the last word suddenly became the man remembered for having none. Meanwhile, Crockett's voice carried louder than ever. Talk shows invited her for interviews. Editorials framed her as a symbol of defiance against institutional arrogance. For countless viewers, especially women, immigrants, and communities long ignored, her stand wasn't just about a single courtroom clash. It was about being seen, about watching someone stand tall in a place designed to keep people small. And as the clip spread, one truth became undeniable: Crockett hadn't just silenced a judge. She had ignited a movement of validation and pride. But the question still lingered: what did this moment truly mean beyond the viral frenzy? The answer would come in the lesson she left behind. In the days that followed, Crockett refused to let the confrontation be remembered as just a viral moment. She reframed it, reshaped it, and gave it meaning. When asked about Costa's aggressive questioning, she didn't dwell on his arrogance. Instead, she spoke of dignity. Power isn't about how loud you can be, she said. It's about how deeply you can stand in your truth. Her message cut deeper than any political soundbite. It wasn't simply Crockett versus Costa. It was dignity versus arrogance, courage versus fear. And in that matchup, the underdog won. She reminded the country that institutions can try to belittle, but individuals armed with integrity can rise above them. Her clapback became more than a defense of herself, it became a defense of everyone who had ever been underestimated. Crockett's voice carried the weight of generations who had endured the sneer of authority and the smirk of dismissal. She stood as proof that resilience doesn't just survive, it transforms, it inspires, it reshapes the narrative. For every student told they didn't belong, for every worker spoken over in a meeting, for every immigrant made to feel invisible, her moment was theirs too. The lesson was clear: you don't need the robe, the gavel, or the institution to stand tall. All you need is the courage to refuse to shrink. Crockett embodied that courage. And in doing so, she showed that silence isn't always a defeat, it can be the sound of arrogance collapsing in on itself. Her stand wasn't just for her seat, her district, or even her moment. It was for every voice that has ever been pressed down, every person waiting to see dignity triumph over dismissal, and in that triumph, Crockett rose for us all. Judge Gregg Costa tried to silence her. He tried to press, to intimidate, to force her into the corner where so many before had been left voiceless. But Jasmine Crockett refused to shrink. With calm precision, with dignity unshaken, she turned his authority against him. And in that unforgettable moment, Costa didn't just lose control of the room, he lost the very weapon he had built his reputation on. His silence became her victory. This was more than a courtroom exchange. It was history in motion. A reminder that arrogance, no matter how powerful, will always collapse when confronted by truth. Power bows to dignity. Fear dissolves in the face of courage. And Crockett's clapback was proof that even the heaviest institutions cannot silence a voice rooted in justice. Her words will echo because they carry more than politics, they carry the universal fight to be seen, to be heard, to stand tall. And now, that echo is yours to carry. If you believe in dignity over arrogance, if you believe that truth will always outlast intimidation, then subscribe, share this story, and add your voice to the movement. Because Crockett's stand was just the beginning. The rest is up to us.